All right, gang, let's get started. Good morning, good morning. Happy Monday morning. So let's start with this, resistance. Some of you are probably feeling this. It's an interesting statistic, and I often talk about this time of the year. Those people who set New Year's resolutions, 80% of them in the month of February actually give up on their New Year's resolution. And there could be many reasons why, but ultimately the reason is this. If we're going to use one word, it's the word resistance. And what is resistance? Well, just simply stated, I would say it's an opposing force. And what that force looks like, it can take various forms, right? It just depends upon what we're talking about in terms of the progress we're trying to make. But resistance is an opposing force. And the fact is that 80% of people who set goals at the beginning of the year give up that goal, interestingly enough, by February. So just a month into the new year, which is interesting. So my question for you is, what's your habitual response to resistance? And notice I said habitual response, because I think that the way you do one thing is the way you do other things, that it bleeds into every area of your life. So one of my favorite conversations about the idea of resistance and pushing forward is the story of Chuck Yeager. Chuck Yeager was a test pilot. He flew in World War II. Interestingly enough, he lived in Los Angeles. He just passed away a year ago. I want to say that he was in his late 80s, early 90s. But the man in 1947 broke the sound barrier. He was the first person to break the sound barrier. And he did so in 1947, actually in the Mojave Desert here in California. He flew over 150 different planes during his career, and had over 10,000 of hours in flight in those various planes. And the man's story is very interesting, especially this one, that on a day in, I think it was the fall, October of 1947, he had the opportunity to be the test pilot to get into this experimental rocket ship to see if they could break the sound barrier. It had never been done before. And at the time, of course, we were competing against the Russians, and it was really the beginning of the Cold War. And so it was really important that we develop planes that had the ability to be propelled by rocket engines for more advanced fighters for war. And so it was Chuck Yeager's job to get in this cockpit of this experimental plane, really a rocket, and see if we could break the sound barrier, if the United States could break the sound barrier. Well, just a couple of days before he was supposed to get in the plane, he was on a horse. Apparently he fell off and he broke some ribs. And had his superiors known that he had broken ribs, they would not have let him get in that cockpit and fly the plane that day. But he didn't tell anybody other than his wife, and he used actually a broomstick that he had fashioned, shortened it to the length that he needed, so that when he got into the cockpit, he could just use it to prop up the canopy and lower the canopy and then push it back up when he needed to get out, because he couldn't extend his arm because of the broken ribs. So Chuck Yeager gets in the plane, and he gets up in the air, and as he's approaching the speed of sound, which is approximately 761 miles an hour, he was reporting to ground control what his airspeed was, and also just what was happening in the plane, what he could tell. Now, they had a lot of electronic equipment on the ground so that they could monitor as well. But Chuck Yeager was there to tell them what was happening physically with the plane, with him, because they didn't know. They didn't know what was going to happen. It had never been done before. They weren't certain if man could withstand the pressure of getting to that speed. They didn't know if the ship that they had, the rocket ship that they had, the plane that they had made, could withstand it. And as he was getting closer and closer to that mark of the sound barrier, he was ticking off the miles per hour, 756, 757. And as he continued, he noted that the plane was rattling almost uncontrollably. He was concerned that it was going to disintegrate, that it might not make it. And he continued to tick off the miles per hour, 758, 759. And the plane began to just shake violently. And at that point, Chuck Yeager had a choice, gang. He had a choice as to whether he was going to throttle back and get back down on the ground and say, gang, we have got to engineer something that is better than what we've got here, because this plane is about ready to disintegrate when we approach the sound barrier. And I, quite frankly, don't want to die. I want to be able to do this again and again. He had that choice. Now, see, we know that he did, in fact, move forward because he broke the sound barrier that day. But Chuck Yeager didn't know that he was going to, and neither did ground control. And the world didn't know that he was going to do it. And yet Chuck Yeager pushed forward, 759, 760. And then all of a sudden, the radio that he was communicating on went silent. And ground control couldn't hear Chuck Yeager. All they heard was silence and then white noise. And then within a fraction of just a second, they heard a very large boom. And the first thought was potentially that the rocket ship had, that the plane had exploded as it hit that barrier, that resistance. And then all of a sudden they heard over the radio wave, 761. They heard Chuck Yeager's voice as he hit the sound barrier and the speed that he needed to in order to break that barrier. Then, of course, the crowd jumped and cheered and celebrated, and history was made that day. So, gang, the reason I share that story with you is because we all face resistance the way Chuck Yeager did. Now, his was a different situation, right? But when I say resistance, that we all face it, that we do, whether it's in relationships or it's with our health or in our business, resistance faces us every day. If you go to the gym, you face resistance there. See, the real barrier, Chuck Yeager taught us, wasn't the sound barrier, but it's the barrier that we face every single day and the resistance that life offers us. So my question for you is, when resistance intensifies, because it does, and you know what I'm talking about, do you throttle up or do you throttle down? What is your habitual response to resistance? It's very interesting. I go back to the statistic of 80% of people by February have given up on their New Year's resolution. Where are you relative to the goals that you set at the first of the year? You know, it's one thing to say, well, I remember what they are. It's another thing to say that every single day I'm doing what I know it takes in order to achieve that particular goal. So I want you to write this word down, non-negotiables, non-negotiables. I believe there are three things that should be non-negotiables for you if you want to achieve your New Year's resolution or whatever your goal you have set, whether it's the first of the year, at any time of the year, at any point in your life. There are three non-negotiables, particularly as it relates to real estate. I want you to write down the three P's, the three P's. P is in Penelope, the three P's. The first P is practice. The second P is perform. And the last P is to persist. So the non-negotiables are the three P's: to practice, to perform, and to persist. So number one, practice. Let's talk about that for a second. You know, it's, I think it was it Simon Sinek? I want to say it was his book Outliers. I don't remember, but he talked about the 10,000 hour rule, that to get exceptionally good at something, to really become a master or a virtuoso or to be an expert at it, that you have to practice it for 10,000 hours. And a great example of that would be Chuck Yeager. The fact is, he logged, no coincidence, over 10,000 hours in the air. And it was no coincidence that the United States military chose Chuck Yeager to be the man who was going to be breaking the sound barrier if they were going to be successful at all. Michael Phelps, for example, the guy who has won more gold medals than anyone on earth ever in the history of the Olympic Games, right? The number of hours that he practiced, 6 hours a day for 7 days a week, for years, in order to achieve what it is that he achieved. The idea that we could be successful and achieve our goals and not practice, especially in the business of real estate, gang, Doesn't make any sense to me. I find it very interesting that real estate agents forget or ignore the importance of practice on a daily basis. When you take a look at other professions, those who earn a great deal of money, especially the amount of money that we expect to make or hope to earn in real estate, and then we don't practice. You take a look at actors and actresses, or you look at professional athletes and the amount of hours that they practice. A great example is you look at the NFL, Super Bowl coming up this next weekend. And you look at the number of hours that those men practice off the field in order to play the few minutes that they play on the field. Here's an interesting ratio, gang. NFL players will practice for 43 minutes off field outside of regulation game time for every 1 minute of regulation game time. It's a 43-to-1 ratio. Think about that. Now, I'm not saying you have to have a 43-to-1 practice ratio. In other words, for every minute that you present to somebody or prospect, that you've got to be practicing 43 minutes. But what if you did just a 1-to-1? Just imagine the difference in results and your skill and your ability to go out and to conduct yourself in a very confident way, in a very convincing way, in a compelling way to get people to choose you versus the competition. So my question for you is this: are you practicing enough that is consistent with the level of expectations that you have for your production? Does your expectation of income, is it being matched by a level of practice that's consistent? And if it's not, then you got to adjust it. Because the only way to get to a certain level of performance is to, of course, practice, which means that you should be scheduling that. So my question for you is, do you have practice scheduled into your daily or weekly schedule? Gang, I think about the number of hours that I took to learn, for example, the listing presentation or conversation, or the scripts for FSBOs and expireds, or just listed, just sold, or sphere of influence. Hours and hours and hours doing that at the gym and in the car, recording myself and then listening to myself repeat those words and then chanting along with myself as I was driving or as I was working out, so that I learned how to use those words in a way that it didn't sound wooden or cardboard, but rather sounded authentic and sounded like me. So the first of the 3 P's is to practice, because that's what professionals do. Number 2, perform. Perform. Now, look, perform meaning it's your job. Do your job. It's one thing to practice. There are a lot of people who will get ready so that when they're ready, they'll be ready, right? We've got to go out and actually use what we've practiced. And here's the thing: you don't need to know everything in order to go out and perform. Just go out and do it. So perform, and you don't need to be perfect. Just go out and do it. And as you do it, you'll figure out how to get even better at it. But see, your job is to go out and talk to people. Your standard should be, gang, if you want to achieve your goal, your New Year's resolution for production or whatever it is, right? GCI, working with an X number of buyers or sellers, your standard should be that if you're not talking to people on a daily basis, you're not doing your job. In other words, no talk, no job. And if there's no job, there's no income, right? So no talk, no income. Your standard should be, I would suggest, that if you aren't talking to people on a daily basis, you're not doing your job. And in the quote unquote real world, when you don't do your job, you don't get what? You don't get paid. So perform. So my question for you is, do you have in your schedule time set aside specifically to prospect, to talk to people, to talk to sellers, to talk to buyers, to follow up? In other words, to reach out, establish relationships, to grow those relationships, and give people an opportunity, a reason to choose you versus the hundreds or thousands of choices that they have in the marketplace. And then the final thing is this: persist. Persist. Gang, I believe that the great equalizer in our business is consistency. Consistency. I can show you someone who is highly skilled, but not very consistent, and they're going to get poor results. But then I can show you someone who has a low set of skill, but they are highly consistent, and they're going to get better results than the first person, the person who's highly skilled but inconsistent. And then I can show you somebody who is highly skilled and highly consistent, and they're going to get exceptional, amazing results. So every day, gang, you get to decide whether, as you move forward, you're going to practice, you're going to do your job, and you're going to be consistent in doing those two things. My question is, do you want to be the highly skilled person who is inconsistent and gets poor results? Do you want to be the low skilled person who's relatively consistent and gets some results? Or do you want to be the highly successful, exceptionally, amazingly performing person who has a high level of skill and a high level of consistency? And I think, of course, we know the answer to that. We know what you want. Otherwise, you wouldn't have set that New Year's resolution or that goal. Gang, just remember that success has rules. We may not like the rules, but success has rules. And we get to choose every single day if we're going to follow the rules or we're going to violate them. And the fact is, most real estate agents get up every day, and they don't do it consciously, but they do it through their actions, decide to violate the rules of success in real estate. I challenge you not to be one of those agents. Get up every single day, recognize what the rules are, that you have to practice, that you need to perform, you need to do your job, and you need to be consistent. And if you'll follow those rules, gang, I promise you, you will win the game of real estate. All right. Having said that, let's finish this up because we are out of time. We'll do the closing affirmations, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to go out there to practice, to perform, and be consistent at those two